second MASTS seminar, which is a joint thing between the University of Aberdeen and Marine Scotland. We're also broadcasting live the MASTS webinar, so thank you very much to MASTS for hosting us. First, we're just going to have our speaker talk for a while, and then we're going to have questions. So if you're listening in the webinar, if you type your questions into the question bar, and we'll answer them at the end. Okay. So it's my pleasure to introduce Matthew Palmer, who's visiting us in Aberdeen from the National Oceanography Centre in Liverpool. He's a physical oceanographer, done a lot of work on turbulence and mixing in shelf seas. He did his PhD at Bangor Uni with John Simpson, and then moved to the NOC in Liverpool, where he's been heavily involved in the Liverpool Bay Coastal Observatory, and has been working extensively with gliders in the last few years, which is what he's going to talk to us about today. So I'll pass over to him. Thank you.
Thanks, Sophie. Good morning. Thanks for coming on. Thank you for anyone else who might be listening externally. So yeah, just to pick up on a couple of things and just fill in some of the gaps at Jackie's introduction. So I came originally to Frauman Oceanographic Laboratories, of course, not only being in existence for the last 3 years. I've been there about 7, 8 years now. And I've always been a bit of a tech geek. Any new bit of kit that comes online, I'm always quite happy to play with it. And so I used to manage the Liverpool Bay Coastal Observatory, and of course any sustained observation program is always looking for ways to cut costs, particularly in terms of ship time. And of course, the idea of these autonomous systems coming online was very attractive to us. So we were lucky enough in I think 2007, Rutgers came over and did a demonstration for us alongside Teledyne with their gliders. About the same time that not Southampton, of course, which wasn't associated then at the time with Hull, we're also starting to get into the use of gliders with the rugby program. So these things offered us some opportunities, but they weren't really being used on the shelf sea environment. And really, that's where my science, that's my area of interest. So one of the things we've been trying to do at Liverpool, almost on our own really, there's not many groups doing this, is push them into sort of more dynamic and sort of more difficult to work regions. And what I'm really going to focus on today is, although I've done a lot of work with turbulence, and I might come on to that if I have time at the end, and what we're doing with gliders in that respect, really I just want to give a demonstration of some of the scope of the work we are doing. There aren't many, unfortunately, finished results here. A lot of this is ongoing work, as we're still struggling, although we're awash with kit at the moment. We've got lots and lots of gliders. We actually don't have anybody, not to my knowledge, who's actually tasked scientifically with actually working with gliders full time, which is amazing, really, considering we're up to 30 odd gliders now. Hopefully that will change soon. Otherwise, to be honest, I'll get even grayer. And but hopefully this will spur some interesting discussion, answer questions, and like I say, if I have time, I'll go into some of the more specialist applications that we're applying at NOC and beyond. So, obviously, with any of these tech-heavy type of applications, there's always a lot of people to thank. There's many others. I'll try and mention a few names as we go along. But Chris Balfour here is my lead engineer for the glider work that I've been doing, and he's really given the last 4 years of his career into getting some of the more complicated aspects of glider work up and running with a lot of success. And just this is my current intern who's working with me on gliders, who is only a second year Bath undergraduate, but is putting us right on actually what we do with a lot of the glider data. And that's now. I mean, that's the level we're at with a lot of these things, dependent on money coming in from here, there, and everywhere. So I'll do a brief introduction to ocean gliders, for those of you who are not too familiar, but I'll assume we can all get our heads around a basic platform that carries a CTD and anything else we can throw at it. And then I just want to go through 3 case studies which come from ever decreasing depths and length scales from the shelf break work that we've been doing as part of Fastnet. A few of you might be involved with that, being led by Mark Immel over at SAMS. And then onto a UK IMON project, which was looking at sort of the capability of gliders in shelf seas. Very shallow water in sort of my stomping ground of Liverpool Bay. And then if I have time, I'll come on to some more specialist applications, like I mentioned about turbulence, etc. So a few of you might be familiar with MARS. This is the marine facility. It's a national facility being set up by NOC. And it's benefited from a massive amount of investment lately in capital infrastructure that's coming through from Department of Business Innovation and Skills. We've attracted a large amount of funding which is now, well, as you can see here, I think these are current numbers. These might even have increased recently since we had a lot of purchases on the last financial year. But we're certainly up to around 30 gliders, some of which are, these are the ones I'm more interested in. These are the specialist turbulence gliders. You can see that we're developing this very large fleet. This isn't Mars. This is a recent workshop over at Clopan in the Canaries. But really, it's the only one I had available that showed the sort of level of capability that we're getting to. These are fleets of gliders now. We haven't necessarily put more than 4 or 5 out in the oceans at any one time yet, but the next step for us is to work towards fleets. So hopefully some of the results I'll show you today from individual gliders and the complexities of individual gliders, try and scale that up to the idea that, well, the very near future is this. And also really to advertise Mars a little bit. I don't work for Mars. I'm a scientist, not a technologist, but I think they give me some money for some things. But they also are becoming very effective in providing technical and planning support, and that's for the whole community. So, please, I'm happy to sort of field some questions about how people get involved with using this new capability as well. So the very basic understanding of gliders is that these are buoyancy-controlled platforms. And that's very much how I look at it. I don't get too technical hands-on with these things. I'm a scientist. I want to put my instrumentation on a platform that I can trust to deliver, for my type of work, continuous or long-term profiles, so from near surface to near bed, hopefully. I work generally in the shelf seas environment, so I work with gliders that have a 200-metre capability, which gives me a full coverage typically near surface to near bed. We can operate all the way up to about 1 metre to the surface, essentially as long as we don't pop out the water again. And these things undulate continuously on whatever programming schedule that we've given it, and can provide us a profile around 2 H. So if you're working in 100 metres of water or 100-metre profile, you'll get a profile every 200 metres, horizontal length scale. And I suppose the take-home numbers here, so that you can visualise sort of what's going on in the next few slides, is that they travel horizontally around 0.3 metres per second. They're very slow. And the vertical velocity is 0.2 metres per second, very slow again. Capability, therefore, is that we can get quite high resolution in the vertical from these measurements. Of course, anyone who works in tidal regimes, which I do, will realise that this is a lot slower than a lot of the tides in the UK, and you can imagine the complexities of trying to work in sort of that sort of thing. And we'll see some of those complexities in a moment. Without harping on too much about this, again, from the technology perspective, all we really need to, the only thing I'm really caring about is that I can, each time this glider comes to the surface, we can tell it to come to the surface every dive if we wanted to. That's very inefficient. It stops, it only moves forward while it's profiling. So every time it comes to the surface, it will ping up to us via Iridium. Depending on how much money you want to spend, you can take as much data from that as you want. And that will ping back to us at the labs exactly what it's doing. You can take some information. We tend to decimate the data down to some handleable, some sort of volume that we can handle easily, and we can get an idea of what the local conditions are like. The beauty here is that we can also talk back to the glider, and if we're not doing what we thought we were doing, or we're not in the right condition, we're not in the right sea conditions that we thought we were sampling, we can then tell the glider to go and do something else, change its waypoint, sample differently, turn off and wait for a couple of days until something happens. It's a very nice bit of kit. It's very, this two-way communication makes it very, very attractive. To give you an idea about what you can put in a glider, this is a typical slope and shallow water glider in this case, and this is split apart. So this is the two ends that control the buoyancy, controlling the glider, the onboard CPU, etc. Communications at the back here, and with the exception of an oxygen cell and air oxygen sensor at the back there, this is the payload. Sorry, there's a human. So you'll see the sort of size. Payload that you have available to you is this. Batteries being stored in the outer compartment, sort of extreme compartments of the glider, and that's the typical, very close to the 911 Seabird CTU. And we've also got a wet labs triplet in this one. So you've still got space for a few more bits of kit, and you can, if you've got specific requirements, you can think what you could put in there. And for the glider, for the turbulence work that I do, that's not enough space. I also want the CTD as well, so I actually just mount it on the spot. So there is capability there to piggyback. So again, it gives you an idea of the sort of capability of these things. So to go on to the first case study, this Fastnet data, the data I'm going to show was taken in 2012. And Fastnet is investigating flux across the topography of the Northeast Atlantic. So essentially we're interested here in the physical exchange across the shelf break region, and we've got a couple of focus, well, 3 focus regions, the first of which was the Celtic Sea in 2012. Recently completed was the Malin Shelf study in 2013, and I believe there's ongoing work in the sort of more outer reaches, which people here, I can see in the audience, and Alejandro are involved with extending this work through this year. The glider program has been really to try and put it, it's one of the best attempts actually the UK so far has done in trying to put small fleets of gliders out to try and come up with some sort of holistic picture of what's going on. The success of that is variable. We're still trying to work out how we interpret this data, and I'm going to show you data from one of those gliders that was deployed at the Celtic Sea shelf break here on this spur, where we had a number of moorings. I won't be showing this today, it just got too complicated in the number of slides I need to introduce. And we'll be following, originally planned to follow this transect, but as we always do, we get interested in something, and you'll see that we did follow this transect. This is the actual plotted positions. We saw something interesting coming out of one of these canyons, so we went off a little look over here. But I'll just be presenting some sort of continuous transect data from there in summer 2012. So how to present lots of data taken over a long period of time. So this glider was out for about 2.5 months in total. But what I've pulled out of this is something I hope we'll get some level of coherence from. We're just looking at what I call the southern transect on these plots. So it's this across-shelf continuous transect. So in the first instance going from east to west, then coming back along the same line west to east. And if you've got really good eyesight, you'll notice there is a few gaps in between this as we sort of got our heads around actually how we fly these gliders. They didn't quite do what we thought they would do in the first instance. But eventually we get into an almost continuous back and forth transect, in this case over about a 30-day period, with around 2 days, a little bit more per transect. And they're sort of, I've done them in time. They are almost similar in location. There's a bit of variance there. Trying to plot them against position, you can imagine the tide, we've got elliptical tides there, typically around 0.5 meters per second. We've got baroclinic velocities from the internal wave field at around 0.5, 0.4 meters per second. The gliders, every time they dip beneath the surface, do a lot of funny things and they pop up not necessarily where you want them to be. How you interpret this data gets a little complicated. You can see there's a dense amount of information here, but obviously putting on one slide is very difficult to interpret. All you can take in this one at this instance is that we've got thermal stratification that changes in space and time. We get increasing stratification through the summer months. We're around day 177 there, which I believe is someday in June, through 26th of June, I believe, through to about 28th of July. So we can see the onset of continuing summer stratification, and we can see a lot of variability there due to the internal wave field at the side. There's a highly energetic internal wave field. There's a lot of things going on, and a lot of variable mixing going on that you can see, so we get a more or less diffuse picnic line through the spring-leaf cycle. I think more interestingly from this data set is the salinity, in that we use the salinity as an obvious tracer for pelagic water potentially coming onto the, Atlantic water coming onto the shelf. And again, if we take this east to west in the first instance, so the first profile is from on-shelf to off-shelf, east being on-shelf, we'll see that as we have this fresher on-shelf water here, separated by about 0.2 PSU, I think, 35.55 to 35.75. We see the bluer, fresher water on-shelf here in the top panel on the left, through to the saltier water as we get off the shelf. The interesting thing here being that we don't actually go up into very deep water here. And we'll see that we already find that this saltier water is already detached. It's no longer sort of associated with the bottom mixed layer. What we actually have is this salty intrusion at the picnic line here. And we get some very dense and very fine scale information. Obviously I've put a lot of data on one slide here. But you can appreciate that there's a lot of information here about how that varies spatially and temporally. And then we see coming back on that same transect, although this is actually a couple of days later, this next slide, we see that this is a persistent feature coming back again, and then through the spring leaf cycle we see how that gets mixed. Sorry, we're near a neat period here, I believe, and we see how this gets slowly mixed into the bottom mix layer, or potentially there's more water being forced up. That's not quite clear. And we can get a lot of information here about the cross-shelf exchange, and following work from this will be sort of trying to calculate that sort of flux across that shelf grade. So, important information there coming from a long-term deployment, very fine-scale information, but the things that's slowing us up there is the interpretation of this sort of semi-Lagrangian platform that's being swatched through a very dynamic environment is actually the thing that's sort of giving us the main problems at the moment. How do we actually constrain that to a sort of robust understanding without just averaging everything out and saying the average here is this and the average there is that, and there's a difference between it, so there must be some exchange. We'd like to be a little bit more intelligent about how we interpret that. And to be honest, we're still struggling with those sort of questions. For the people here, obviously, my interest is from the physical perspective, and Fastnet is a physical program. There was not enough sufficient funding, unfortunately, to extend that all the way through biogeochemical. But I did convince people to leave the wet lab triplet on for a short period of time. Unfortunately, because of energy constraints and wishing to keep it out for as long as possible, they were turned off. Mark Inall was listening by the PSO at the time, or PR. But we did gather, in this instance, just 2 transects. There's a few days separating these 2. Central time on the first slide being day 179 and was 1183. They're both on the same colour scale. Don't believe too much in the numbers. We still don't have many calibration points, unfortunately, for the fluorescence. So let's just call it fluorescence, if you like. But we see a dramatic change over a short period of time here, and we can obviously see a lot of complexity in the vertical and horizontal structure of the SCN. So, there's a lot of things that we might potentially still be able to get out of this. But the good news is that although we weren't able to support the biogeochemistry in this instance, the ongoing Chelsea biogeochemistry program, I have convinced people to put gliders out in the same area. This is the spur that we're looking at from Fastnet, and we currently still have 2 gliders. This is a snapshot from yesterday. Just pulled this off our web page. We have 2 gliders out. There's actually 4 gliders out there. 2 of them are doing something else. One of them doing this sort of crisscross shape, similar off the slightly deeper shelf. And this is the on shelf down to 200 meters. This is in bar, and the other off shelf one that occasionally gets down to its full extent of around 1,000 meters. And again, we can see this is just a screen dump. It's fixed at 2 something. It's obviously out of scale, but there's a lot of information there that we're coming off, and that data hopefully we'll be successfully recovering within the next couple of weeks, and we'll have a nice data set there to compare to what we've already found from the physical perspective in 2012. One thing you can take from this, those of you interested in sort of the platform, if you like, is this is supposed to be a nice tools are sort of 3 months worth of tidal influence on that platform. If it was just being moved around by the tide, of course, fully Lagrangian, that's fine. We can sort of interpret that. But of course, we've also got our own trajectory and sort of going through that. We don't have an exact way of calculating its speed, never mind its velocity. So therefore, where it is in space and time and how we interpret temporal and spatial changes is a complexity. I'll keep coming back to that because really this is the sort of thing that certainly stopping publication. But more results to come from that study. And like I say, even though it's 2012, we're only just getting round to that data. Let's come further on shelf now. A second study that we received from the Survey Network, the idea here is to try and get agencies and academic institutions and universities working more closely together, particularly where they make observations in shelf seas. And so I'm on one of the NOC to work a little bit more closely with AFPI, CFAS, and people. And we were looking for a demonstration project. There was a number of demonstration projects came out of this, and Russ Wynn at NOC sort of coordinated a number of these things, which actually were reported in a number of CFAS and DEFRA reports, that being one of them that I contributed. But we did this pilot study last year, And so my idea to try and link these agencies up was, well, everyone's interested to see what gliders can do. Can we replace ships with gliders? Or can we at least sort of get more information from gliders that we would otherwise achieve? So we deployed a glider from the Isle of Man actually and flew it over and we've used 2 waypoints here to try and link up what the gliders are seeing with what we're observing from long-term sustained observations from the ACPI Western Irish Sea mooring, that's been there for some 20-some years, and the last few years been deployed the CFAS Smart Boy in the Celtic Deep. The idea being here that a lot of the problem with the gliders is that if you put a glider out for 3 months but then don't visit it, you've got really no chance of getting any robust calibration on that. So the idea being that if we can use these Smart Boys as waypoints, we also get added support that the ships are coming alongside to do a calibration and turnaround on those moorings. Gives us security as well for the gliders, because otherwise we have to go and charter a ship to go and get it if something goes wrong. And it seems a nice little study as well. And it also showed the sort of long-reaching capability in that we can throw one off here, throw a glider off the Isle of Man fairly cheaply from a small boat, fly it over to here, do our monitoring for a few weeks, fly down to the Celtic Deep, do a little bit more monitoring down there, and then fly it home and do a cheap recovery in the Liverpool Bay area, which is what we managed to do. It's a fairly cheaply put together project. So I'm going to show you some results. I'll just show you the whole thing that came back from the data. Again, dense amount of information here. But essentially, this is where we deployed. This is so black line here is latitude. Red line on the top panel is longitude. So we threw it in at around 54 degrees north, which is just the, like you see here, it's around the area of the Western Irish Sea mooring. We kept it in situ for a while we did some calibration exercises with the ACPI ship Charistes. Flew south. You can see the influence of the tide here, even on this sort of very scaled down Smart Boy, CFAS Smart Boy, and then did about 2 weeks of back and forth east-west transects using the Smart Boy as a westernmost waypoint, and you can see we sort of kept this sort of continuous transect going before we flew north. I'm assuming that was a spring type period we came up in, and did a very similar thing using the Western Irish Sea ACPI mooring again as our westernmost waypoint. And I've just plotted everything out now. I'll go into detail of these 2 panels in a moment. But we came out, this is fairly early, this is day 95, which would be in March sometime, around the 1st of April. We can see fully mixed cold water column, and then as we're heading south, we start heading into slightly warmer water, which eventually stratifies, thermally stratifies, before we come back up through the well-mixed Irish Sea. You can see a temperature increase from our previous travel through that area, before we got back to this frontal region where we see a lot more complex dynamics. We see a salinity change associated with that, and I'll come on to talk about those in a moment. But we managed to keep the science sensors on throughout. Obviously, ACPI and CFAS wouldn't really be interested in just temperature or salinity. And we've got chlorophyll, calibrated chlorophyll using what was available to us at the time, and not hand on heart, but something close to what we think oxygen saturation was at the time. I wouldn't use this in court law, but it looks pretty. So, temperature salinity first. So we've gone now to the west, so this is the Celtic Deep bar then. We're doing a east-west transect. So this is, I've just put longitude there, goes, I realise, the left panel in the top, top panel there, the left-hand part of that just shows the transect going in longitude. And so in each of those plots next to it, we get a back and forth west to east to west. So the central point of that being the easternmost point. Does that make sense? Again, plotted against time. we'll see. I don't want to spoil anything. In detail, incorporates potentially hundreds of profiles. So there's a lot of information. Consider these as a CTD profile. There's a lot to be taken out of this. We're still getting to the start of exploiting. I'll skip through these fairly quickly though, because I want to get to the chlorophyll. Seem to see the Celtic Deep certainly adds strong thermal stratification by this time now. We were looking at about 2 weeks after, and obviously we had satellite information to confirm, after that sort of initial spring bloom period. We're up in day sort of around 140 now, so we're well into late May, June sort of period, isn't it? So here we can see, actually let's take the temperature first. We can see that we're firmly stratified again, and through time, the location of the glider, we were using a fixed transect. We would have liked to have spun off and looked at other things, but the idea here was to try and maintain some sort of fixed area so we can get a better idea of the sort of temporal evolution of the region. And we can see that it sort of fluctuates between fully mixed, and we get this sort of mixed period where temperature gets mixed down almost homogeneously to the full depth here in the furthest east again, and before we again get some stratification during that period. So we're going through a neat spring, neat period there. So there's really nice signatures within that. If we look at the salinity here, we get some really nice features going out in very fine detail. So here we get some obvious saline stratification in the westernmost region. Salinity generally is homogenized throughout this period in the easternmost, certainly within those first three sampling periods. This is maintained throughout. However, we get sort of a very complex changing structure throughout these periods. So these are repeats on the same area here, and we get temporal evolution of these is very, very complex, and it's one of the things really that we're using to try and validate the model developments at NOC for the new NEMO shelf models, and of course we can go back on sort of previously developed POLCOMS models to use that to better understand how, for instance, mixing within our models, which we know we're pretty poor at doing, how they can sort of replicate these very complex structures. Okay, so maybe of more interest is the chlorophyll signature. So the same panels as before. So like I say, we had seen some onset of sort of biological growth. This is again fluorescence. I apologise to anybody who works in these fields. Chlorophyll biomass. Let's call it scaled fluorescence, if you like. But we did see some onset signature. We also saw a slight development of SCM already here. So we are seeing sort of already quite variable subsurface chlorophyll, chlorophyll. Phytoplankton are doing the funny things. Spatially, they're very. I'm trying to think of the phrases. So we've got but relatively to what we obviously get towards in the end, we were able to actually capture that sort of development in this region. Now, of course, we're only sampling one space. This could be migration or infection of a much stronger signal coming through the Celtic Sea. And I'll leave that to sort of biogeochemists to inform me on those sort of things. But we do see it's really nice temporal evolution of the SCM within this region. And again, this is through a full spring neat cycle. So we can sort of see the controls on this. We see no obvious sort of mixing out at any period of this signature. Again, we've already discussed the temperature. It's the same time as previously. If we go to the more complex region in the Western Irish Sea, so let's look at the bottom panels. You see this by the time we get there again, we've gone much later in the time. So we left the Celtic Deep at day 126. It took us a good while, almost 2 weeks, to come up through the Irish Sea again. And by the time we get there, we've got this very well developed chlorophyll maximum at the base of the pycnocline associated with the westernmost stratified regions. But again, where we saw evidence of sort of mixing within the eastern component, even when we had strong stratification. You can see evidence there of strong thermal stratification in the right panels. We see a much less well-defined chlorophyll maximum. And I really do need to point out as well that you'll see also, sorry, do I exit or do I? Oh. Okay, and those of you familiar with fluorescence may also pick out that when we have surface chlorophyll here, we're also getting this sort of minimus around midday, and there's been no compensation here made for quenching in surface layers. And again, I need advice on this really. This isn't my field. At the moment, there isn't really any biogeochemistry, biogeochemists associated with this work, so there's a cry for help, really. But we see, again, some very interesting structures in the temporal evolution of that. Again, as we go through through spring, again, we see this mixing up. We see things getting mixed up in sort of homogenized easternmost part of that transect. And then coming through the neat period when we start seeing the onset of stratification again, I think the color scaling must be slightly different now. Yes, it must be. This is the same data. But we haven't seen, obviously the phytoplankton aren't responding to that immediately, so the potential that everything's been mixed up, and that is my sort of very basic interpretations of this, that, that there's, well, I'll let you draw your own conclusions. There is no immediate onset of sort of an SCM despite this sort of ongoing recovery of stratification. Actually, I think I've made an error here. You'll notice these two panels look exactly the same. It looks like that. So there is some thermal stratification. I knew there was an anomaly in there somewhere. So some really nice data that's coming out of this is showing, I think, the capability of the gliders in sort of continuous sampling of very complex regions. So I've tried to sort of bring this data together to give me some level of understanding. So what I've done here is each of those passes, we go back to the top panel here, we've got pass 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, sort of separated by the red lines in the Celtic Deep, and then we've got 4 in this instance of the Celtic Deep. Oh, I did actually pull in another 5th, which wasn't a complete transect, which is why it didn't feature in the previous slide. So we've got these are the average scale versus chlorophyll, estimated chlorophyll in each of those passes. So in the Celtic Deep, we see a steady increase, as we can obviously take out of those previous slides. So if you look at the first pass, which is the dark blue, we saw a sort of increase all the way up to the surface, and you can see that clearly. And then we get a fairly rapid increase, particularly by the time we get to the 4th pass, by some 4-fold increase. If we relate this then to a stratification parameter, and I've not defined this in these slides, I apologise, but this is phi. So just take this as a sort of linear relationship of linear interpretation of how to stratify the water colonies. So if we scale that against, we see a pretty linear relationship here. And if we exclude this one outlier in red, we get a very close relationship between the two, which sort of suggests that as stratification, we get stratification and biomass potentially working in a fairly linear relationship during that onset of stratification, during that bloom period. And that's consistent over, like I say, over a two-week period. When we come up to the Western Irish Sea, I was very wary here of trying to do like for like, so what I've actually done is only include the westernmost part of that transect. So I've not used the part of the transect that goes mixed eventually. So again, we're seeing sort of temporal average from those previous profiles. Again, blue there, we know we got there and it was already strongly stratified. We already had a very well-defined chlorophyll maximum in the peak decline. And we see this steadily decrease, the opposite relation of what we saw in the previous position. Again, if we just plot the total calculated chlorophyll, the sum of over the sum of the peak decline stratification chlorophyll compared to the stratification parameter, we see no such tidy relationship. There's certainly something going on. And if we relate this in time, we see that actually it's a spring-neat dependent relationship, which makes sense, although for me this is fairly, well, It's not counterintuitive. You might think that mixing out might reduce the level of the concentration, but because we get an increase during springs, I'm taking this to mean that the potential here is that the nutrients might have been already depleted in that environment, might have already had a reducing production rate, and it's that requirement for extra mixing from the tidal mixing, whether it's from internal waste being generated through that, it's a second order process, or whether it's tidal mixing that's required to actually pump nutrients and growth to support growth during that spring period. Now, obviously that's a hypothesis to test, potentially using the models, but unfortunately models aren't very good at doing that. So there's a couple of nice results there. The equivalent of that up in the Celtic heat there is that you can just get this flat line relationship, which we'd expect from with time, which we'd expect. This is the ratio of chlorophyll to stratification. So there's a nice little study there within the Celtic seas, and it's that and similar studies we've been doing are certainly starting to show that we can operate effectively in these environments. Like I say, with caveat that trying to interpret things in tidal environments is quite difficult. This actually goes back in time a little, and sort of stems from the Liverpool Bay Coastal Observatory work. And so the idea we had really, what I wanted to do was see whether or not we can increase our sampling in the Liverpool Bay region. So we were using ships, the Prince Madog, which is a fair-sized ship, it's only got 3 metre draft, but they're always fairly wary of coming in. It's such a large tidal regime, always quite wary of coming in close to shore. And I was really, what I'm interested in is what's shooting out the plume, and what's being put into the system, by our freshwater inputs to the coastal regions, and the sort of links through to everything else we were trying to do to maintain that observing system were dependent on better understanding of that. So what I was hoping we could do is getting quite close to the coast with the gliders. Anyone who knows this region knows that it's a very flat, shallow sloping environment. So we were never going to get in horizontally too close, but I was convinced them eventually to go down to about 15 metres. And what I'm trying to support is my previous hypothesis from previous work is that sort of there's a gradual mixing mechanism within this system where we see almost an upwelling produced at the coastal regions, which effectively acts as a tidal pump, which allows that fresh water that's coming from the plume to be retained within that system. So that was the motivation for the work. I don't want to spend too long on it. It's a very dense amount of information being put across on these slides, but really just to try and get through to how successful that was and whether or not we could actually operate in these conditions. This shows the glider transects in black. This is the back and forth longitude and latitude there. This is the coast of Wales in England. Mersey's in here. That's the pole at the time, but the NOC in Liverpool. And we get the plume generally showing this, following this sort of shape. So we're just about managing within about 15 metres of water to sort of drift it into the plume region. And we can see here over time, this is time, longitude. We'd see, unfortunately, of course, whenever you throw anything in the water, there's no plume. And eventually we did have this flushing that came through towards the end of the time series. I shan't spend too long on that. If we just plot that over time and depth, again, just to support that, we get the temperature. There's not a lot going on. It's quite homogeneous. We change the temperature slightly, but then we get this flushing event. We get cooler because of the time of year. You'll notice this is day 58. We'll get this fresh water flushing out through the system. Here's the salinity response here. We've got some nearly 4 salinity units difference. And actually this was a good test because a lot of people thought we'd get trapped underneath or above picnic lines and not actually be able to fly the gliders through. So this was one of the first tests of actually putting it into that sort of strongly stratified environment. So a lot of people looked at this and we're now taking it forward and doing other sort of plume studies. That's density, and really just to point out the chlorophyll signature, again not compensated for quenching of the fluorescence sensor, but you'll see that there's a nice response to this flushing, actually within the base of the picnic line, which I think is fairly surprising, in that you get a sudden flush of nutrients, which suggests that if there's nutrients associated with this flushing, then actually it's already been used up before it's got to our region. So the test, my original emphasis on this was to see how well the models actually cope with this mixing mechanism we'd identified, and I think, to cut a long story short, this is the observations. averaged over time and space. Actually just time, this is distance offshore, and we can see that, where have we got, see what units we're talking in? This is d rho by dx, so the change in density with distance, and the keener-eyed of you will notice that this scales to 1.5, the top panel, the bottom one scales to 1.4, which shows that the model we were using to do our coastal forecast at the time basically weren't mixing any of this plume water into the local environment. So if you think of the consequence of that, everything flushing through the river system into the coast, it's just shooting up and getting lost into the RSC. What we're showing is actually what happens is that this mixing is significant, and through a number of tidal periods, by the time it gets to even just that far up the coast, it's managed to mix a lot of this fresher water into the local system, which of course will be retained for a lot longer than the plume. So there's some nice results there from that study. So I'm worried that I want to leave some time for questions, and I've already given you lots and lots of things to think about, hopefully. My work originally, my main interest really is turbulence, and turbulence and mixing, pit-define mixing, and the diffusion of a number of whatever you're concerned with, whether it be nutrients or the survival of anything within the pit decline, internal wave mixing, etc. I would really like, and we are now at a state where we can do this from gliders. I am not going to lead you through that, just to tell you we've done that. And I'll go straight through to my last slide of that, which basically, this is again from Fastnet 2012. So this shows some of that really energetic internal wave field that I was talking about. And essentially, the take-home story is there that internal waves mix a lot, and gliders can measure it. The nice result there is that actually the mixing we've identified does explain the change in density within the bottom mix layer during this period. Something funny happens here, which we're still investigating. But the key thing here is that if the dipycnal mixing actually explains all of the change in density in the bottom mix layer, then it suggests that there's actually no cross-shelf exchange during that period. But that's, you can wait for the paper on that one. That'll be out very soon. So, to summarise, hopefully I've shown that the gliders are a very effective tool, not just in deep ocean where they've generally been used, but they can come all the way through the shelf from very dynamic, very difficult to work in environments such as the shelf break. Didn't even talk about the amount of fishing effort that's out there. In fact, we've not been fished out there. Through to the sort of intermediate stage, working in shelf sea environments, where we're able to sort of assess what's going on in real time, make a judgment on how we continue with our observations. We don't do monitoring, and all the way through to the extremes of that environment, really working in sort of plume environments. And really to take home that glider technology is there and it's ready to use. And I think particularly at the NOC, we're very keen for the whole community to pick up. That's the whole point of setting up this national facility, is to provide those tools for the whole community to get involved with. I think people are being a bit wary. That they're still waiting for the papers to pop out. People like myself have been using these now for a number of years. There's still a very few publications coming through. I think the problem with any new technology is that we spend so long actually getting it in and doing the proof of concept. I think hopefully, some of this has helped convince you and other people's work that the technology is mature and it's time we started moving forward as a community and sort of using this, not instead of shipboard measurements, but alongside. I think that's the best way forward. Like I say, there are some issues over quality control, and I think the key one of that is that people are too quick to immediately go into the fact that these are easy to use plug-and-play tools. They're not. They're very complex bits of equipment, and the belief that you can throw it in and trust to the same degree. However, CFAS has been very successful having oxygen sensors out for a long period, and I'm sure other people in Marine Scotland, etc. So there are techniques for validation, cross-calibration maybe, having more than one glider out at any one time might be a good way forward. And we certainly have them now. With this large fleet that's ever increasing, we have that capability. I think that's enough speaking. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Matthew. We move on to questions. If anyone?
One of the issues that you pointed out is the importance of being able to position them accurately in the water, know where they are basically. So you get data and you don't know where those data comes from, it is a problem. What technology have been put in place as you know, to try to improve that? And for example, you have models in the water. I mean, is there any way of getting them to talk to the gliders so they can kind of triangulate where the glider is and stuff like that? Or are people using, I don't know, wave gliders to try to communicate and locate where the buoyancy glider is?
Okay, so to repeat the question, relates to sort of how we know what positioning the glider, what position the glider is when it's subsurface. We do only have that limited information. And yes, there has been. I mean, University of Washington, who are leading a lot of the glider work, developed the sea glider, for instance, but also developing a lot of the technology and developments, have flown gliders under ice many years ago. Using a transponder network and using triangulation to know exactly where these things are. That's something the NOC are now taking forward. I believe we have funding availability to start looking into that over the next few years. For me, that's been one of the things I've always wanted to look at is through a simple transponder network, whether it's to go under ice. You can imagine putting through a transponder network during the summer period and being able to put them under such in such environments. It depends how much you want to know exactly where it is. I mean, if you're happy, it depends what you're measuring, isn't it? I really struggle with a lot of people presenting data at the moment. I saw some recently at the Fastnet meetings. People are calculating things like depth mean velocity. Because the glider comes up here, it should be there if it had gone in a straight line. So therefore, we'll calculate the difference between the two, and that will give us a depth mean velocity. Well, as soon as you have an internal wave which does that, and it moves, so the second it's going down in a different field as it comes up in, you actually don't know what it's done beneath. So you do need to get down to a very fine scale of understanding of what it's doing. And whether a transponder network can give you that either, I'm not sure. So one of the steps forward, putting ADCPs on with bottom tracking potentially in shallow waters is one way, doing dead reckoning type techniques. And there's a lot of people looking towards that. I've just got my first glider with ADCP. Unfortunately, mine's upward looking because I care more about surface type systems. So the technology's there. Someone's got to pay for it, and yes, you can. But it depends. If you want to get down to the absolute fine scale, it just means staying in a smaller area as well, doesn't it? It depends what you want to do with your glider. So yes, you can do that, but we don't.
What about limitations then in speed areas with stronger tides? Where does it not be able to function well?
Well, Teledyne have developed, and we've just purchased at NOC the capability. You can also put a thruster on the back of that, so we've got a prop essentially. Now, obviously, that's takes a lot of energy, and that's always our enemy. So we try and keep it in the water for as long as possible. So we've actually got a trial going out in October. I found out yesterday. So Russ Wynn has got some funding to sort of test a number of different platforms, and it'll be the first test of our thruster-capable gliders. And essentially, what that will do is give you, I'm not quite sure the numbers, but up to 1 meter per second capability. So you can imagine putting in a near coastal environment, actually just being able to put these things out either straight horizontal line, or just giving a bit of extra power to profile much quicker to get out of problems. We also have a problem. Deep ocean guys have a lot of problems with the same thing, where they get caught in an eddy and they just can't get out of it. You start having sort of eddy currents, sort of 0.6 meters per second, and you've got this slow-moving glider. All of a sudden, that thing you're aiming for is useful. So yeah, the capability is there. It's a trade-off of energy.
Wondering about the dense species in the footpaths. Are they data gaps, or is it just choose environment property? They're comparing the Fastnet versus your OMG, like is in for more data gaps in the Fastnet footpath than the OMG. Is that?
Yeah, this is a plot for a paper that we're just putting together. Oh yeah, sorry. The question was relating to gaps in the data. If you look on the plot that I've just put up, I'll remove this, there's a big gap towards the beginning, and that's because iridium stopped working. Unfortunately, we're learning all the time of these things. So previously, if it didn't find iridium, it was told to stay on the surface, because we were quite worried. We only had one of these gliders, the turbines gliders. We now have 3 or 4, so we might be a bit more willing to let it dive again, having not spoken to us. But because we were checking it continuously, we said, if you don't talk to us, stay there and wait until you have. Unfortunately, iridium is also used by US military, etc., and I don't know what was going on in Afghanistan at the time, but it didn't work for quite a long period. Small problem. I mean, we could have just told it to keep diving and talk to us later, which is what we now do. But at the time, we were a bit wary. These gaps were just that this was for a particular calculation and where I didn't trust the data enough, or whether it was it didn't do a full profile. I just removed it. So yeah, you can do a number of different things with it. The gliders, because you don't know what it's doing until it comes to the surface. If anything goes wrong, we tell it to come to the surface. Obviously, when you're in ice environments, that might not be a good idea, but I tend not to do them. But generally, we get very good coverage. It will profile continually until it hits a point. It does bounce off SCM sometimes.
I've heard and I've read quite a bit about using gliders in not like in the science application, but in the operational application like the deep water horizon. But I haven't really come across much detail of how they were used. Do you know anything about how they were used in there? Whether they were just mapping the area, whether they were trying to follow the oil plume? Okay.
So the question's, what operational applications have been used with gliders? The example being for the Deepwater Horizon, and I think Rutgers got involved with one of those studies. I can't remember exactly what they had on those gliders at the time. I think it was mainly looking at model validations. I think with that study, a lot of people just seemed to throw their kit in to be seen to be helping. I'm not sure how much help that was. I mean, there are hydrocarbon sensors that can easily be fitted to gliders. Whether they're fully integrated in gliders will give you real-time delivery there, that's another question. I'm not sure. I'm sure if anyone's doing it, Rutgers would be. You're probably aware of their capability. But there's certainly, in fact, I believe NOC are also looking at sort of hydrocarbon sensors for investigating leaks. It's a nice potential application in an operational sense.
Just to remind the people that are watching on the webinar that they can type in questions.
We'll not have those in.
And we'll answer them. Back to the next, or in fact, Beth's got the next question.
So you showed one comparison with the ball pumps output. Have there been other comparisons with some of the shop edge work, or other planned comparisons?
Yeah, I mean, like I say, it feels like we've been doing gliders for a very long time. So I think the question was, have there been other comparisons other than the sort of pole pumps comparison I showed in the slides with model output data? It seems the obvious first step of these things. I've done in a small sense. The UK IMON data actually went direct feed to GTS, was actually assimilated into the Met Office Coastal Ocean forecast models, and I've got a short report of that, but more will come out of that eventually. So there's an application with models, but from a forecasting perspective, not necessarily looking retrospectively. There's lots of ongoing work that will be done within Fastnet, certainly, and there will be more work done within SSB that I know of, because that's what I'm involved with. Gliders, I think that the wariness of the modelers is that the way the gliders, it's too easy to model bash with all these things, especially when you get very fine-scale data. No one really expects it, depends what you're looking for in a model as well. But it's, I think people are a bit wary of direct like-for-like comparison. Again, in that environment, really, I was only trying to compare over quite heavily averaged periods. It's the only way I see that you'd ever do it. We are, though, however, there's some really nice results I think we were talking about earlier on about the MIT GCM work that they're doing down in Plymouth. And they're having a really, they're getting some great successes with modelling the internal wave field there. And one of the things with gliders is, because they're slow, we resolve part of that internal wave field. So we're actually trying to interpret what it's seeing, rather than just average out all that sort of hysteresis, if you like, it goes down in one state and it comes up in another state, and is that a wave, or is that just the glider not working properly, or whatever? We're trying to actually interpret the glider data more using those models, and hopefully then that'll also inform us. So yes, personally, I have lots of plans to do that. People is the key thing stopping at the minute. But I'm not aware of particularly large-scale studies that do this. I might be wrong. Certainly not on the shelf. There's not many people doing these things.
Do you have any last questions? Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming and for listening in, and thanks to Matthew